Hello, welcome to my channel. This is KK Crochets. I'm Khadijah, and this is where I talk about everything that I've learned on my beginner crochet journey. I'm so glad you joined me today because I'm going to talk about something that I have been thinking about for a long time, and I hope you're excited for it too, because today we're going to talk about yarn weight and crochet hook sizes. So what is the significance of yarn weight and crochet hook sizes? Well, when I first started out, I didn't really know. I was not aware that there was a classification system for yarn or that there was even more than one hook size. I only knew about the hook that had come with my kit, my Woobles kit. That was a 4mm hook, and the yarn weight that came with the hook was a number 4 yarn weight. And that was a intentional choice by that designer, which made it very easy. That was another piece of that kit that made it really easy to kind of ease into crochet, because they chose the yarn and they chose the hook size that accompanies that yarn. They chose it for you. I think one of the trickiest things that I've had to learn is how hook size and yarn size should be paired. The importance of this is that the weight of the yarn and the size of your hook is actually going to determine the size of your piece. Those are very important factors to consider in amigurumi, because you can have pieces as small as these little Woobles kit animals, or you can have pieces as big as this replica of my dog. And that is all dependent on the weight of yarn you choose and the size hook that you use with the yarn. So let's get into it. This was one of the first mistakes that I made when I forayed out into the world of crochet without my kit. I found a pattern and I bought yarn, and I came home, I started to crochet, and immediately I knew something was wrong. I knew something was wrong. The very first thing was that my tension was very, very loose. It was much too loose for the yarn that I was using. I was using a number 5 bulky weight yarn, which was a heavier weight yarn than my kit provided, so I should have sized up my hook. I used a 4mm hook size because that was the only hook that I had. I had no clue that there were different hook sizes. My tension was so loose that my stitches were huge. My stitches were basically big holes, and the stuffing was completely showing through my stitches, to the point where you could poke your fingers right into the piece through the stitches. It was pretty bad. I didn't recognize the relationship between the size of the stitches, tension, and the weight of the yarn. It was an important lesson, and I'm glad I learned it. Yarn weight is on a scale from 1 to 7. There are actually more yarn weights on that scale, but today I'm only going to be talking about weights 1 through 7 because those are the weights that I use in amigurumi making. So the easiest way to figure out what weight yarn you have is by looking on the yarn label. It's usually listed right on the label. The number will be between 1 and 7, and it's usually superimposed right on top of a little graphic of a picture of yarn, right? So that's the easiest way to tell what type of yarn weight you have. As far as what those numbers represent, starting from number 1, you're going to have your lightest yarn weight, which is to say your thinnest yarns. All the way up to number 7, you're going to have your thickest yarn weights, and those are necessarily going to be a little heavier. Yarn weight can vary greatly. We have yarn that's very bulky and will create very big pieces, and we have yarn that is a much lighter weight and is better for creating smaller, more detailed, delicate pieces. There are a few brands that do not list yarn weight. I find that those are often brands that are not made in the US because the particular yarn weight convention that we use, I'm not sure if it's actually used in other countries. So keep that in mind when you're buying yarn from overseas. Some companies do use that 1-to-7 scale, like Yarn Art actually uses that 1-to-7 scale, and it is a yarn that is made in Turkey. So some foreign companies will use that same scale. However, there are other ways to determine what type of yarn weight you have outside of the scale. I'm not going to get into that in this video though, because it's a very detailed process and I just want to intro basic yarn weight. Starting with number 1, yarn weight number 1 is called super fine. It's also known as light fingering weight. On the label, however, it will read number 1 super fine. This is the same size yarn that my crochet thread comes in, and it is great for detail work on your amigurumi. I use it for making eyelashes, eyebrows, and for any type of stitching that I need to do when I have to stitch pieces together. Number 2 yarn weight is fine. Number 2 yarn is also known as fingering weight or sport weight. I use a lot of number 2 yarn. Most of the items behind me on the shelf are made with number 2 yarn. It is a very versatile yarn with very little fuzz, very lightweight, usually comes in small skeins because a little goes a long way with this yarn, and it's usually used to make smaller pieces. Number 3 weight yarn is called lightweight. It's also known as DK. I haven't used any number 3 yarn yet. I just haven't had a project that called for it, so I haven't used any. But I have used number 4 weight yarn, which is called medium weight. It's also most commonly known as worsted weight yarn. You may also see it listed as Aran weight yarn. Number 4 is a very common weight for amigurumi makers. I am currently working on 2 pieces that I am using number 4 weight for. This is the weight that 100% acrylic yarns come in, and a lot of folks love acrylic yarn for its versatility and its affordability, and for the fact that it is widely available. Next, we're going to get into our heavier weight yarns, starting with yarn weight number 5. This is called bulky yarn, and it includes yarns like velvet and some t-shirt yarns. So number 5 yarn weight is the weight of velvet yarn, and I do often use velvet yarn when I'm making amigurumi plushies. And then we're getting into number 6 weight yarn, which is known as super bulky yarn. Super bulky is typically the weight of your chenille yarns, which are a little bit thicker than your velvet yarns. And again, I use those quite often for plushies. As a matter of fact, all the yarns that you see here are number 6 weight yarn. Super bulky. And then you have number 7 weight yarn. This is known as jumbo yarn. Jumbo yarn, good example of that is Bernat blanket yarn. This is often used in blanket projects and in super-sized amigurumi plushies. Okay, now that we've talked about yarn, let's talk a little bit about hook sizes. So just like yarn, hook sizes have several different conventions that can be used to classify them. There is a lettering system that can be used to classify hooks. There is a numbering system that can be used to classify hooks, and these classifications differ from country to country. The classification system that I use is the size of the hook. The size of the hook actually coordinates to the diameter of the shaft. So this portion of the hook here that's straight and consistently sized, the diameter of this portion corresponds to the size in millimeters of the hook. So this one, for example, is a 6mm hook. It has a shaft diameter of 6mm. The hook sizes that I use most often are going to be my 3.5 and 4mm hooks, as well as my 5.5 and 6mm hooks. But I do use a wide array of hook sizes depending on the weight of the yarn I'm using. And now we get into the fun part, which is how do you know which yarn weight goes with which hook? It's highly individual because it does, like everything in crochet, have a lot to do with your individual tension, which is how tightly or how loosely you hold the yarn while you're crocheting. And that's something that it takes beginners a while to develop and to recognize. When I first started crochet, I had a very loose tension. I had no idea how to hold my yarn. When I finally figured out how to hold the yarn, I became aware that I was holding tension, but it was still a while before I could switch between low tension and high tension. Hi, it's me from the future, just popping in because as I was editing this video, I realized that I left out a really important piece of information as a starting point for pairing yarn weights and hook sizes. As a general rule, as your yarn weight gets heavier, your hook size will go up. Conversely, as your yarn weight gets lighter, you will be using a smaller hook size. So keep that in mind as we continue to talk about how the pairing of hook sizes and yarn weights will affect the finished piece. It's important to note that your yarn weight and hook size are going to be the primary determinants of the size of your piece. So for example, a lower yarn weight and a lower hook size is going to produce a smaller project. Conversely, a heavier yarn weight plus a larger hook size is going to create a larger project. And if you keep that in mind, you can kind of customize your projects depending on what size you want them to be. I think a good place to start when you're trying to figure out which hook to use with which yarn weight is the yarn label. The yarn label has a lot of useful information on it, including a recommendation from the manufacturer on what hook size you should use with that particular yarn. For this number 5 bulky yarn, the manufacturer recommends a 6.5mm crochet hook. Now, one of the prevailing opinions in the amigurumi world is that you should default to a hook size that is 2mm smaller than the manufacturer's recommendation, because for amigurumi we want very tight stitching that no stuffing will show through in our finished piece. So using a smaller hook size than is recommended with this yarn will result in smaller, tighter stitches. And of course the reality is that you can use whatever hook size you want with this yarn, but you have to recognize how that hook size will affect the size of your stitches. If you have a number 5 bulky weight yarn, you're going to get bigger stitches by default because the yarn weight is heavier. If you use a smaller hook size, then you're going to get a smaller hook than the average size that you can make with this yarn. If you use a bigger hook size, you're going to get a bigger stitch, and all those factors are going to affect the size of your finished piece. So starting with the yarn label is a good jumping off point to figure out which crochet hook size to use with the yarn. The next place that I would look for help figuring out which hook size to use with which yarn weight is the pattern. Whatever project I'm completing, I look at the materials list to see what type of yarn and what hook size the designer used to make this project. I also look at the finished size of the project, so I know that using the materials that the designer has listed, I can produce a project that is the same size the designer has listed in the pattern. Let's assume that I want to make a project that is the exact size the designer has listed in their pattern. In that case, I will buy that same yarn weight. I will use the same hook size that the pattern recommends. If I want to make the piece smaller, I can either use a lighter weight yarn or a smaller hook. If I want to make the piece bigger, I can use a heavier weight yarn and a bigger hook. And I actually do have one example of how the yarn weight changes the size of your finished project. I have a project that I completed with a number 4 weight yarn and a project that I completed with a number 5 weight yarn. And forgive me, y'all, because the one that's made with the number 4 weight 100% cotton yarn is probably like the 3rd project that I did, and it shows. That's all I'm gonna say about that. But the sizes between these 2 pieces are drastically different because of the different yarn weights that I used. I'd just like to show you an example using the Chrissy dolls I've made using patterns, free patterns that are available on Amigurumi today. The finished size on these patterns is anywhere from 23 to 26 centimeters using a 2mm hook with number 2 weight yarn. When I first started, my range of hook sizes was limited. Using a smaller hook size, I figured out, requires quite a bit more control, quite a bit more experience. So when I first started, I probably used a number 4 or 3.75 hook size on these dolls. Once I had a little more experience, I started using a 3.5mm hook, and that resulted in a much neater piece. And finally, I decided to try the recommended hook size, which is 2.5mm. And so I finally got to see the doll the way the designer intended it to be, which was 25 centimeters in height. So I'm using number 2 weight on all 3 of these dolls, and you can see how the different hook size produces slightly larger or smaller dolls. So this is a perfect example of how the hook size directly changes the size of your finished project. I hope this helped. This information is something that I wish I had had when I was starting on my journey. And believe me, this information is not meant to be exhaustive. There is so much more to know about yarn weight, how it's determined, how the fibers contribute to the weight of the yarn, how the number of plies plays into this. I just can't get into all that right now. I'm trying to keep it very basic so that you have the knowledge that you need to go out and get yarn and corresponding hook sizes to make the projects that you want to make. So thank you so much for stopping by. And as usual, I just want to remind you, I had to remind myself this week, follow the pattern, trust the process.